Hey there, this is Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil. Here, we're sat watching Bolsonaro lose authority as the right maneuvers to supplant him. Bolsonaro himself isn't explainable as a phenomenon without going back to June 2013, where a massive protest wave was initiated by demonstrations against transport fare hikes. Those protests gutted the political class's legitimacy. No mass protests have emerged in Brazil to challenge Bolsonaro as of yet. But elsewhere in Latin America, protests seem to be sparking up everywhere. I'm recording this on Wednesday the 23rd of October, as Chile is in flames. Dozens have died, a state of emergency with nightly curfews has been declared, all prompted by, and here we go, public transport fare increases. It's still totally unclear where this will lead. In Ecuador, meanwhile, there's been weeks of anti-austerity protests led by indigenous groups and others responding to the ending of fuel subsidies. Meanwhile, in Bolivia, the presidential elections on Sunday, the 19th of October, saw Evo Morales narrowly pass the bar to win in the first round. But accusations of fraud have led the opposition out onto the streets and Evo to declare a state of emergency. Evo Morales is in fact one of the last men standing from the region's pink tide, especially of its more radical wing. But if we flash back to November 2015, we'll find that it was in Argentina where the first pink tide government fell. That was Cristina Kirchner's in November 2015, which announced a sort of neoliberal return as Mauricio Macri took over, promising pro-business counter-reforms. Now, 4 years and a historically large IMF bailout later, it looks like Cristina Kirchner is about to come back into government in elections this coming weekend. Cristina, though, wouldn't be president, but instead vice president. Leading the ticket is Alberto Fernandez, who was chief of staff to Nestor Kirchner, Cristina's late husband, a decade ago. So the question here is the neoliberal offensive again on the back foot after yet another set of dismal failures? And what is the nature of the popular forces that are rising up to challenge it? Right, so this is Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, and George Hoare is in London. George, I mean, we're here to discuss the upcoming Argentinian elections, which, as we'll find out, are a little bit of a foregone conclusion, but maybe not quite so foregone as people are talking about. But really, all I want to do is talk about what's happening in Chile, because it's absolutely kicking off there.
It is in that Masonite phrase. Certainly is kicking off. No, I think it's very surprising, from the outside, how something so seemingly small as a price rise in public transport has led to fires and a country at war with itself, as the president described it. So I think, I think it would be good to put, to touch on that as well and put it into the context, I guess, of perhaps this, where is Latin America, to generalize in terms of that neoliberal reaction to the pink tide, and then maybe seeing a reaction to that reaction almost.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I guess one thing we can discuss is to the extent to which the pink tide, in certain sense, was a kind of, as we've done before, a kind of instance of left neoliberalism, obviously completely different to your Clintons and Blairs. Far better, really, than that. But, at least there's this kind of conservative reaction which came at the end of the pink tide. And, maybe that's just very unstable, and that you need some kind of handouts along the way to provide that sort of regime with any sort of stability. And it's interesting, like how, as you say, one little one price rise can just set off this chain of reaction. Though, I guess it's worth pointing out, Chile, I don't know if people have had a chance to see the videos on this. George, did you see the videos of what happened basically before the riots really started, which was some direct action of people, opening the gates to, public transport, to the metro and stuff, and just letting people stream in, what people call auto reduction, basically not paying for stuff, which is great. And actually puts in mind, this is what Extinction Rebellion should be doing instead.
Yeah, I mean, it's what Occupy did, I think 2011 maybe. And it just shows that people prefer free public transport than people standing on top of their public transport, on top of their tubes, meaning that they can't go.
Make people's lives easier. You know, that's a good hint for politics. That's just as a very basic starting point.
There you go. You know, not just talking about politics, but that's real advice that any activists out there can apply.
All right, so we're going to try to hopefully touch on Chile and Ecuador, but we've got to talk a lot about Argentina. So let's dial up Pablo.
Yeah, let's do it. Beep, 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 beep. No, you need to get one of those that rotary ring phone that just for about 3 minutes as you're putting in the country code as well. Sorry,
alpha bunga bunga, fucking analog hipsters.
Yeah. Well, how would you record a podcast in an analog way? You'd have to commit it to vinyl.
First press of the new Alpha Bunga Bunga episode. Yeah, the whole global thing also becomes pretty difficult.
Well, we'll mail it direct to your door.
This is what people were talking about when the protests first broke out, but something totally different might be happening now. But we guarantee that it's still topical.
The only exclusively vinyl podcast.
So this is Alex O'Keefe in Brazil, George Hoare is in London, and we're very happy to be joined today by Pablo Pryluka, who's a PhD student at Princeton studying social and economic history of Latin America, and was previously an activist in Argentina when he lived there. Hi, Pablo. Great to have you.
Hey, how are you guys? Thanks for having me.
Very well.
It's an honor to be here.
As people will have heard in the introduction, delighted to be discussing this on a Monday as there are riots and protests seemingly across the region. So first of all, I think it'd probably be worth, before we delve a little bit more deeper specifically into Argentina and then round out talking about Chile and Ecuador, that what the kind of general feeling is, because I mean, you know, Chile has exploded in the past couple of days, seemingly out of nowhere. We had weeks of protests in Ecuador, and now there's this election coming up in Argentina. I mean, what do you feel like this signifies? If you can take just an initial temperature take of what's going on across South America right now.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, right now, I would say it's hard to tell because we are still seeing how the events are happening. But what it seems is like during the last 2 months, I would say, first Peru, then Ecuador, now Chile, they are going through pretty intense social upheavals and social unrest. So, like, if we look back 2 or 3 years ago, people were saying that the pink tide in Latin America was kind of coming to an end with the election of Macri and Bolsonaro. And what we are kind of seeing now is that this kind of re-emergence of a neoliberal alternative in Latin America is finally seeing the first signs of having problems dealing with the economy, but also with social expectations about the future. So I would say that right now we are seeing the collapse of these kind of governments and the emergence of governments more conservative, like in the case of Bolsonaro, or in the case of Trump here in the United States. And that's interesting because it implies difference with the most traditional neoliberal governments we've seen in the region in the 90s, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's the most interesting feature of these days.
Yeah, and I guess these protests, riots, upheavals have emerged under relatively sort of different governments, at least. I mean, Piñera in Chile is a conservative, whereas Lenín Moreno is kind of a center left.
Was supposed to be
center left. And certainly far to the right of his namesake at any rate. So
but we had the resignation of Kuczynski in Peru, and then Vizcarra closing the parliament and calling to new elections. So it seems that the political stability that this kind of new Pacific group governments were expecting to have 2 or 3 years ago, now it's beginning to have facing some problems, I would say.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable, and I think Argentina was probably the first indicator that the pink tide was coming to an end? I mean, that was in November 2015, and then a year later it was the end of PT, or rather less than that. Really, only a couple of months later, it was the end of PT in Brazil. So I guess what happens in Argentina is fairly important also for the rest of the region. So turning to that country specifically, what would you say it's like in Argentina now? I mean, for those who aren't familiar, you might want to fill us in on this. There's a degree to which these elections are a foregone conclusion because of the primary system, which is relatively complicated. It might be worth you explaining what that's like initially. But also, if you can tell us what the sense is there right now. Is there a sense of expectation of a change of government, perhaps a relief that the Macri government might be coming to an end, or just maybe not too much sense of any hope that things will significantly change?
Well, I mean, yeah, those are very good questions. Let's start with elections and the primary. So we have this primary system where every party has to present a candidate or many candidates, and you can vote inside like any primary inside the party that you want. I mean, you can choose the primary you want to vote in. What happened in the last election is that there were no primaries, actually. I mean, all the parties present just, or most of the parties present just one candidate. So it was like a kind of a fake election, if you want. I mean, but the final numbers were quite significant because Alberto Fernandez did a really good election. He got around 48% of the votes, while the current president, Mauricio Macri, only got around 33%. So it seems that the elections of next Sunday could be, it seems that the output is going to be the same. I mean, we still have to wait, but that's the feeling right now. I went to Buenos Aires for the last time in Argentina like a couple of months ago, right after the primary elections. So the feeling was that this government is finally coming to an end. But I mean, although there is obviously a feeling of hope about the future, there is a sense that even if Fernandez wants to start a really progressive government, the current situation is quite hard. And to understand that, we need to understand the last government of Macri, which of course had like a pretty bad performance in economic terms, in terms of standard of living and in terms of real wages, in terms of inflation and other problems that affect the everyday life of the Argentinian population, but also the coming back to the IMF and the growth of the foreign debt in Argentina. It's a problem that will have consequences in the future. So in that sense, the feeling right now is that there are many macroeconomic imbalances, and the things doesn't look pretty well for the future, at least for the immediate future.
So I just had a question, I guess, about maybe some of the wider context specific to Argentina. So I guess one of the particular parts of the ideological constellation that gets talked about a lot in analyses of Argentina is Peronism. So I just wondered if you could explain a little bit to our listeners what exactly this means and why it plays such an important role in Argentinian politics, and how maybe Macri might be seen as, I guess, a bit of an exception to this way of governing.
Well, let's start for that last part and then go back to Peronism. So Macri is the first president, if you want, coming from a political party openly situated on the right side of the political spectrum, that it's actually finishing his presidential term. So in the history of Argentina, I would say. So this is the first time that the right in Argentina has a competitive candidate. I mean, the other times that the extreme right and the center right came to government together in Argentina was with different kind of dictatorships and military regimes. So to understand, I mean, it's kind of impossible to explain Peronism in a nutshell. But I would say the main feature of Peronist governments was the increasing of the standard of living of the working class in Argentina. Even if that maybe wasn't the original project of Perón when he went into politics. What happened is that the Peronist coalition between the mid-1940s and the mid-1950s, when Perón was overthrown by a coup d'état, was an increase in the standard of living of the working class and of the political organization of the working class in trade unions and inside the different factories in Argentina. So in that sense, Peronism had a long-standing presence in Argentinian politics, mainly because what happened after 1955, after the coup, was that Peronism was proscribed from Argentinian politics and only came back in 1973. And after that, we had one of the bloodiest South American dictatorships from 1976 to 1983. So what we had after that was first a kind of a pro-neoliberal reform government, with someone who actually came from the Peronist party, and that's perhaps the most hard thing to explain to someone who is not familiarized with Argentinian politics. I would say it's something similar to what happened with the PRI in Mexico, but in the sense that a government who used to be more left center or something like that began to adopt the IMF ideas and exert or just adopt the structural reform program. So that leaves us with the 2001 crisis, which is pretty well known because of how deep it was and the consequences it had, and then the emergence of this new movement called Kirchnerismo or Kirchnerism, which in some senses revealed the idea of a Peronist identity in Argentina.
It might be worth actually explaining a little bit what Kirchnerismo is and how it distinguishes itself from the Peronism of the past. I mean, the Peronism of the past is, a multi-headed beast, as you've already indicated. It can point in kind of more center-left or in corporatist directions and more neoliberal ones. And it seems that most roads in Argentinian politics point through Peronism in one way or another. As you already said, I think there's been Macri's will be the first government in history from a non-Peronist party to actually finish its term. Correct?
Yeah.
So that's quite remarkable. It seems that everything goes through Peronism, and yet there's a lot of different politics.
Since the coming back of the democracy after the last dictatorship. Yeah.
I should have made that clear. Yeah. So in that sense, and you can see, as you've spelled out, that there is at least a kernel to Peronism, which has the incorporation of certain sections of the working class, certain working class demands. To what extent does Kirchnerismo do the same, or to what extent did it do the same over the pink tide period in which it was in power?
Well, that's a good question. Kirchnerism kind of did the same thing, but the situation was completely different. What you had after the 2001 crisis was a huge amount of the population just outside the labor market and outside any kind of employment. Without any employment, so the unemployment rate was quite high. And what you also have, and you're familiarized with that because that's one of the main features of the neoliberals models was the emergence of the informal sector and the rise of the informal sector, right, of the economy. So Kirchnerism kind of incorporate a lot of unemployed people into formal and informal employment. And with that, you had especially during the first 8 years of the first 4 with Nestor Kirchner, and then the first government of Cristina Kirchner, the economy grew quite fast, and that implied that the standard of living especially of the working class and the underclass, grew quite fastly. So by 2010, the Argentinian economy began to stagnate or show some signs of stagnation. And the last 4 years of Cristina Kirchner government were kind of stable in terms of economic growth. So in some senses, Macri's promise had to do with maybe trying to find faster ways or easiest ways to solve the problem of inflation, but also finally reducing poverty and find a stable path towards development right now, and we knew it in 2005, but in 2015, but right now it's quite obvious. Those were not more than promises. And what we are seeing now is that inflation is still growing, poverty instead of reduced increased, and unemployment as well, while real wages decreased in these last 4 years. So right now the situation is quite bad in terms of the macroeconomic or the economy in Argentina.
Yeah,
so
I think it might be
before
worth...
we...
Oh, sorry, go ahead, George.
Yeah, before moving on to, I guess, some of the discussion of the economics, it's just wanted to ask a quick follow-up. You mentioned the coalition that of class forces that backed Peronism in the mid 40s to mid 50s.
Yeah.
Who are the social groups that made up this Kirchnerist coalition and are backing Hernandez today?
Well, I mean, there was certainly certain elite sectors who obtain pretty nice benefits during the Kirchnerism years. But also, I think what gave a lot of stability to the Kirchnerism project was that they could incorporate many of the social sectors who had been previously, especially during the 2001 crisis, part or involved to the Piquetero movement in Argentina. I mean, different kind of social movements that began to grow during the last part of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. And that, I mean, mainly this kind of underclass that began to be incorporated by Kirchnerism into social welfare. And in that way, they began to find, let's say, new institutional channels to pose their claims and to talk to the state, if you want. So in that sense, a lot of people began to feel identified with Kirchnerism. And if you see the result of the elections, the last ones, but also in 2017 and 2015, you will see that all the industrial or post-industrial areas around the city of Buenos Aires are pretty blue, let's say. I mean, are pretty hegemonized by Kirchnerism or different Peronist alternatives.
Interesting. I wonder also, I mean, I think it might be worth, in terms of talking about the waxing and wanings of the fortunes of Kirchnerismo, and then, Macri's neoliberal assault or neoliberal attempt, how epochal these shifts seem to be. I mean, the 2000s, Argentina benefited from the commodity super cycle in the similar way that Brazil did and was able to surf that wave. Of course, they had some important policies which perhaps were able to maybe sustain a certain growth and make it a little bit more redistributive than if it had been under more right-wing governments. And it might be worth actually exploring what Kirchnerism actually did in power over that period, but also the way in which that comes to an end at the end of the commodities boom, and how Macri sweeps in as an alternative, and the way that the neoliberal Latin American right across the continent really kind of celebrates this as a kind of, now we have the end of these old corrupt center-left governments. Of course, the discourse of corruption being very present from the right. Very often, as we've discussed a number of times on this podcast, and listeners might want to check out our episodes on Brazil if you haven't heard them before, to understand a little bit more of this process. But if you could spell out exactly, how epochal these shifts really feel at these moments post 2001, when the Kirchners come in, then throughout that period in office, and then also Macri coming in.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I remember clearly in 2003, I was young, and Fidel Castro went to Buenos Aires, and he was kind of doing this tour through Latin American countries, and Kirchner just had won the election, so Fidel Castro came for the assumption when he took office in I think it was May 2003, but I'm not sure. No, it was more like December 2003. So I remember there was in 2003 a feeling that something new was coming in Latin America, and in that sense, it definitely had like the sign of new times coming. Of course, it had to do with the commodity boom, but I guess it also had to do with the collapse of the first neoliberal reforms during the 80s and the 90s, especially in the 90s in the region. I mean, if you take a look into the emergence of the PT governments in Brazil, of Evo Morales in Bolivia, even of the first Chavez in Venezuela, and of course Kirchnerism or the Frente Amplio in Uruguay. And by the way, there are elections in Uruguay next weekend. But if you take a look into the emergence of all those movements, almost all of them had to do with the collapse of the neoliberal model or the neoliberal regime that was in power before in different kind of ways. So in that sense, that was like a change in times. What I'm not that sure about is about the end of this pink tide, because if you think in terms of tides, and I'm kind of reframing what Álvaro García Linera, the vice president of Bolivia, it's been working on during the last years, I guess. It's if you think in terms of tides, you need to think in terms of something that comes and goes and then goes further, right? I mean, so I guess that all those governments, Kirchnerism in Argentina, Lula in Brazil, and well, I mean, I don't want to mention all of them again, but were kind of a first wave. And I say this because even if then this kind of conservative backlash that we had in different countries thought about itself, I mean, these new governments thought about themselves as the let's say the end of the, whatever you want to call it, pink tide populist regimes in Latin America. Actually, the situation was different because a populist or a popular or a center-left regime, it's not only about redistribution of income or redistribution of wealth, but it's also about political organizations. So I think if there is an output of those years of what you like to call the Latin American the pink tide, I would say it also had to do with new social movements, new political cadres, and new ways in which the working class and social and popular sectors began to organize themselves. And that was clear when these kind of new conservative governments tried to impose new austerity measures or new structural reforms in Argentina, but also now we're seeing that in Ecuador and in Chile. There is another level of political organization that wasn't there in 2000, in the crisis of the late 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, I would say.
That's interesting, and I think we might want to talk about that a little bit later on. This does seem to be a thread which actually might run through our whole conversation here, but you know, the repeated kind of neoliberal offensives, their failures, and the retreat is something that happens obviously in cycles. But I mean, it seems to be perhaps, and maybe this is a hypothesis we might want to discuss, is something that might be accelerating now, precisely because that the kind of end of pink tide neoliberal offensive seems to be under attack now, or you know, in serious crisis in many different places. And so maybe explain, kind of looking at what prompts that failure is interesting. Also, the degree to which forces can be organized to challenge that is also interesting. I mean, one kind of irony, I'm just going to mention this as an aside before we move on to look a little bit more deeply at the economic situation in Argentina, is the way that the pink tide governments in some ways oversaw the kind of high period of neoliberalism globally. And so maybe, you know, it does prompt the question whether they're a more politically legitimate form of neoliberalism than have been the right-wing governments, which have been much more unstable, it seems. But that might be a question going forward. Oh, go ahead.
No, I mean, there is something about, you were talking about that. I mean, the failures or how this kind of new neoliberal regimes or governments couldn't create or be persuasive enough, and you know, politics most of all have to do with being persuasive and convince people. So when we are seeing this kind of crisis of the new neoliberal or whatever you want to call it governments in Latin America, I would say, I mean, it looks like great news in a way, but I would be careful because, I mean, the other kind of alternative that is emergence is the Bolsonaros of the world, who may also have a neoliberal agenda in some ways, but are much more conservative and much more, anti any kind of civil rights. So when I see Piñera in Chile together with the military, or when I see the collapse of the Congress and the the rise of Fujimorism in Peru, or when I begin to see, like in the last presidential debate yesterday and 2 weeks ago in Argentina, two political candidates openly situating themselves on the right and saying that there was, kind of praising the military for what they've done during the last dictatorship in the country. Well, let me be a bit pessimistic and a bit scary about what is coming. So yeah, I would say that
I think that skepticism is absolutely due, seeing what's happened in Brazil, though. It's also worth pointing out that Bolsonaro's government is pretty flimsy at the moment. He's kind of been abandoned by his party, but that doesn't mean that that a kind of a more, let's say, more traditionally conservative authoritarian government might not be waiting in the wings. After all, even if if Bolsonaro were to be impeached at some point, his vice president is a military general.
Yeah.
So, that the military actually might prove a far more stable ally to capital than, kind of crazy right-wing culture warriors in the guise of Bolsonaro. But but not to talk about Brazil, because we do have to delve a little bit deeper into Argentina.
Yeah.
I think it might be worth talking about, Macri's government and to what extent has Argentina's economic difficulties. The peso has devalued by 50% this year. The significant increase in inflation, the cost of utilities has shot up. To what extent are these things caused by Macri government's rule, or do they just expose the existing weaknesses in the Argentinian economy? I think it was interesting. I was in doing some research for this. I found an Economist article from 2017, which, in its typically kind of snooty fashion, asked at the time of the midterm elections in 2017, asked, is Argentina going to choose sobriety or Peronism? But that's obviously the way that international capital sees it.
It's kind of the same discourse that is going on right now.
Yeah. So if you could explain to us, in your view, what you think is the role attributable to Macri's government and the choices that it made, and to what extent are these just structural features of the Argentinian economy which any government would have faced?
Okay, so first of all, I would say two things. First, to understand Macrism, or Macri's government, I think we need to hint into two things. The first one is, this government is kind of a combination of two things. That's what I'm trying to say. On the one hand, you have like people coming from a liberal or neoliberal tradition, as however you want to call it, who actually think that, or thought that what Argentina needed, or they actually still think the same thing. But what Argentina needed at the time was a liberalization process, and then they need to deregulate the capital account, and they need to deregulate foreign trade and try to eliminate any kind of fiscal deficit. And doing that, the Argentine economy will start running again, because if you have institutions, then those institutions will kind of support government. On the other hand, I do think that Macrism had inside the government people who were just trying to benefit friends and who was just trying to benefit private companies, because they believe that what we call the teoría del derrame. That if you create new wealth, the wealth will just magically be distributed through the whole society, or maybe because they will just corrupt. Which is something that also happened. But in terms of, your question was about Macrism and what happened during these last years. I do think that there were some serious macroeconomic imbalances during the last 4 years of Kirchner government, although those macroeconomic imbalances were kind of worsened by Macri in all the possible ways. I know this sounds kind of harsh, but I do think two things. On the one hand, I think that Macrism was definitely the worst democratic government in Argentinian history in terms of their performance. But I also think that the election they are doing right now is not that bad as many analysts are pointing out. They actually retained 1/3 of the votes, which is quite high. They got like a 34% of the votes. So in that sense, I would say that even if Macrism had to deal with the not an easy situation. What they are like delivering right now, the final. I mean, if they finally lose the election, I don't like to say. I mean, to claim victory. Yeah, to claim victory before it happened. But I do think that the final days of Macrism are seen by economic chaos. I mean, inflation it's like around 5 or 6 points per month. So I mean, foreign debt is above or around 100% over GDP. I mean, the exports are not growing as much. So Argentina is facing for 2020 and 2021 a pretty complicated economic situation, especially related to foreign debt. And on the other hand, the economy is almost frozen right now. I mean, the GDP is barely growing. Investment, I mean, it's not moving as much as they were promising. So especially after 2017, the situation doesn't look good.
So I just had a question on the role of you mentioned foreign debt and the around 100% of GDP debt that Argentina is in. What's the role of this in I guess in discourse around is there a really strong discourse around austerity that there needs to be massive public sector cuts? Is there a lot of resentment towards the IMF, which has bailed out Argentina maybe I think it's 20 something times? I mean, how does this get politicized?
Well, I mean, of course, going back to the IMF didn't have a positive impact on public opinion. I mean, in Argentina, when you mention the IMF, I don't know if probably in other countries it's kind of the same story, but in Argentina, when you mention the IMF, you will not get smiles. So people were quite annoyed on that, but mostly because people knew what was happening. I mean, like what Macrism was kind of doing was replacing internal public debt by taking money from the IMF, and in that way they could reduce the foreign deficit. The main problem of that is that in the midterm, if you don't create enough dollars by exports or different ways, then you are not able to repay. And we know how that story ends. That story usually ends with the IMF suggesting structural adjustment and austerity measures, and that has an impact on welfareism, but also on economic activity, because the presence of the state in Argentina is quite big, and if you start cutting public spending, that in a way implies that you're kind of stopping or slowing the economy. So I guess that's the main thing related to the IMF. It didn't have a very good press, let's say, before Macri went back to them, and definitely and certainly people right now are not willing to hear more about the IMF, although Argentina has a foreign debt that has to face and probably will need to find a way to reorganize the payment schedule.
I mean, do you have any insight or position on why you think the IMF went in for this bailout? I mean, it was the IMF's largest ever bailout, and you know, the kind of Argentina had to do a sort of soft default on it. I mean, why did the IMF opt to renew these loans again after what is that? I think 22 different bailouts by the IMF to Argentina over the years, over the decades. So, what is the IMF's position on this? What do you think?
Well, it's hard to tell because the IMF is changing right now. I mean, the direction of the IMF changed it like a month ago or so. So Christine Lagarde just quit I mean, she moved to the European Central Bank
for another cushy new job. Yeah.
yeah. She got an So it's hard to tell. I'm not a specialist on the IMF. I would say it was quite clear that Argentina was an important case for the IMF, and that's why they are still kind of negotiating with the government and trying to find a way to solve this problem. Right now, I think they're going to do the same with whoever Alberto Fernandez chooses as his economic team. But yeah, I mean, I think it had to do with on the one hand, the need of the IMF to rebrand its own image after the crisis of the early 2000s, and also with the role of the IMF in the international monetary system. I mean, that's why the IMF is there in theory. I mean, it's there to support countries with capital account problems. So, or yeah, I would say external problems. So it's hard to tell why the persistence, why they choose Argentina, if it had something to do with defending a new or supporting a new kind of liberal kind of or righty kind of government in the region, or if the agenda was somehow different. But the fact was that they during these last 2 years, the IMF was quite committed to support Macri's government, although it didn't work out.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess in light of that failure, in light of these serious overheads in terms of debt that Argentina has, high inflation, the situation for many people there in terms of rising costs. What do you see as the outcome? I mean, can you, both in terms of the election, I mean, we foresee the return of Kirchnerismo to power, though I guess it's worth stating that this is Cristina Kirchner will be vice president to someone who's much more a more moderate force, I guess, more even of the center right, I think, from within Peronismo, right?
Yeah.
So what do you see that government playing out like, and do you think it'll be will provide any relief for people, even at a very sort of basic level, in terms of renewing maybe some subsidies to make the cost of to ease the difficulties in terms of cost of living? What do you foresee that kind of kind of renewed Kirchnerismo government actually looking like?
Well, I mean, it's hard to tell. I mean, as an analyst, I would say we really don't know. I mean, on the one hand, we do see a lot of a new generation of politicians being involved with Alberto Fernandez, like the new candidate for the province of Buenos Aires, Axel Kicillof, who used to be the Minister of Economy for Cristina in the last government, and a new generation of people on their late 30s, early 40s, kind of being involved with more relevant positions and coming from a more, let's say, leftist origins. But at the same time, Alberto Fernandez, as you just mentioned, it's a very pragmatic guy, and it's hard to tell exactly how the new government will look like, especially because we don't have we don't have that many clues to figure that out. We don't have the names of the future cabinet, and so it's hard to tell exactly. On the other hand, as an Argentinian citizen, and as a former activist, I would say I'm really looking forward to it. And I really expect they can actually, at least right now, produce an income a distributive shock in terms of income, at least for the people who is actually having a really bad time now. So I hope that's possible, and I hope they actually find a way to go through that without falling into an hyperinflation or increasing fiscal debt, fiscal deficit that much. It's hard to tell. I would say it's like the optimism of what I want and the pessimism of trying to look at the big picture, right?
Yeah. So just quickly, to round off Argentina before we talk about the exciting goings on in Chile and also in Ecuador, what do you see as being the state of play to the left of Kirchnerismo in Argentina, outside of Peronism? I mean, what is the degree of organization? What is the degree of labor militancy kind of at the moment? And is there any kind of rising force on the left beyond Kirchnerismo which might push it one way or another while it's in government?
Well, I mean, I do think that when we were talking about this like a moment ago, I mean, I do think that one of the the main let's say the main outputs of the pink tide was the fact that a new generation of young people began to be involved in politics, and you can see that in almost all of the countries of Latin America. And it had to do with the generation that didn't go through the dictatorships and that have a different approach to politics in many ways compared to the old let's say the old political categories that we already knew. So in that sense, I do think that there is a strong ambivalent movement inside Kirchnerism that I would situate on the left. You have there is a wide array of lefts inside that movement, but I do think that new political organizations like Cámpora or Nuevo Encuentro and other more leftist, like Nueva Mayoría or new or form older political organizations that now are going into this Frente de Todos, which is the name of the political front they are organizing. It's quite vibrant and quite interesting, and we are looking forward to see what they do if they get into power after next Sunday.
So speaking of protests, it's always good to move on to talk about places where there's people on the streets lighting fires, just because it gets the blood flowing a little bit more than talking about IMF restructuring and foregone conclusion elections. So Chile, for those who don't know, as I said in the introduction, mass protests, riots, curfews, and so on. So what strikes me living in Brazil, it's how much what's happening in Chile looks like the Brazil of June 2013, where there's a public transport rise in an otherwise fairly stable situation, posting reasonable growth rates that suddenly explodes, and it's completely disorganized, spontaneous, decentralized, and yet it's also very agitated, violent in certain cases. So, what has bred this, in your opinion? And I guess maybe looking at it perhaps a little bit more broadly, a little bit more trying to theorize a little bit about it. Why is it that these riots emerge around prices and price increases specifically? Why do these politics take that form?
Yeah, and I would add to that what it's particularly interesting. It's hard to talk about how interesting Chile is right now because it's really terrible what is going on right now. We have more than 10 people dead and more than 1,700 in jail. So the situation is quite terrible right now. But in terms of analysis, I would say that Chile was always presented as the student of the class. So in terms of how they were actually reaching, sustaining development, and how they were kind of reducing poverty over the years, but at the same time the levels of inequality, and I think that's where we need to look right now. The levels of inequality kept being quite high. And in terms of consumption and the prices, in this case of public transportation, it has to do with the material conditions of the populations, but also with the perception and the expectations they have in terms of having a certain standard of living. So when people realize that the plans towards the future begin to be in problems, or when they are expecting to have a certain level of upward social mobility, and those promises are finally not fulfilled, partially because they cannot under the current models of economic management. So I would say that when those promises and those expectations about having a certain standard of living, you can wait for it. You can wait for some time, but after a certain amount of time, people begin to feel irritated about it. And sometimes when you only need like a sparkle to set up this kind of huge fires and to have riots on the streets, and that's what we are seeing in Chile, and that's what we are seeing in Ecuador. Chile is an interesting case in terms of that. I mean, you have like a huge amount, or the 10%, let's say, of the population living really well, and then a kind of a strong middle class, but then you have people earning around $400 per month and having to pay at least $1 just to take one subway. So it's pretty obvious that when you raise the public transportation fare, you will have problems. Chile is a country where people, I mean, working class people and also probably lower middle class people, they don't use any kind of heat system during the winter because it's almost unaffordable. I mean, so I'm talking about like every day.
It's cold in winter in Chile, for those who
and it's
who
really
don't know.
cold. Yeah, it's really cold. So
it's chilly.
Oh,
sorry?
I'll have to cut that out. That's terrible.
So it's British English. Chilly means cold.
Yeah. So okay, I got your point.
No, you were right to blanket initially. That just carry on.
You gave exactly the response it deserved. Which was
it took me a while, but I got it. So I guess that, yeah, I mean, we need to understand the problem of inequality in terms of the perceptions about the perceptions that people began to have about the role they play in the society where they live and what they deserve and what they're entitled to. So I would say that right now, and there are many scholars and intellectuals working on these issues of inequality, I would say it's not just income or wealth inequality, but also the perception about inequality that we need to take into account right now.
I think one of the striking things is that the objective conditions in so many countries really seem to be there for this sort of these sorts of protests and these sorts of verging onto riots in many cases, because it's not even a particularly complicated point, but the inequality and the expectations that particularly maybe downwardly mobile middle class younger people have are decreasing. While inequality is increasing, expectations are decreasing, and it seems like Chile, from the outside, as Alex said, seems very stable, but then in fact there are so many things, from privatized water to pension system crisis to education and healthcare systems in terrible situation, that it's in some ways you sort of want political scientists to do some science and do some prediction, but of course that's not the sort of activity that they're engaged in. They just explain afterwards rather than predict beforehand.
Yeah, sure. You begin to have, I mean, when you have this process of, and you were mentioning Brazil and the riots and the social upheaval in Brazil like 3 years ago. It was 2015 or 2014?
2013. Yeah, I mean, 2013 set off a wave of mobilization that lasted about 3 or 4 years, really, and changed shape quite significantly. But it initially started precisely with transport tariff rises.
But I was thinking also that in terms of this kind of tunnel effect that you have when certain societies began to experience economic growth for a while, and this idea of the tunnel effect is like where you're in your car and you're in this tunnel. I mean, the transit is not moving and cars are just there, and then the right line begins to move, and then you have the expectation that, okay, if the right line is moving, at some point it will be my turn. But when after a couple of hours you are still in the same place, then you will begin to feel frustrated about it, and you will begin to feel more irritated about why the right line is moving while you are stopped there, and maybe you only need a sparkle, you only need like the rise of public transportation first, or like in the case of Ecuador, the cancellation of one of these fuel subsidies to launch a pretty strong social upheaval.
Yeah, no, indeed. It is interesting how it's more rising expectations which prompt these outbursts. And it's rather different to something like an economic collapse and protests, riots, upheaval that emerged from that, like emerged in Argentina in 2001. I mean, the situation in Chile right now, obviously it's early days, so it's hard to say too much. But even so, it's prompted by something really rather different. It's prompted by just as in Brazil, rising expectations and the frustration of that. And maybe if I could ask you, seeing as you study kind of the interlinking of consumerism and development, I mean, why is it precisely that price rises are the thing that bite? I guess it might be that as a hypothesis, in a neoliberal era where a lot of legitimacy is bought on the basis that you have rising private consumption, that when that comes to a halt, people burst out in rage, basically, because it's something that bites quite strongly, this frustrated ambition to be able to consume more and better things and have a better standard of living. So it's when fuel prices rise, or utility prices rise, that people are brought out onto the streets, probably more than kind of labor militancy actually does, it seems, these days. Would you agree with that kind of picture?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that there is such a big difference between neoliberalism and what we had before in terms of the importance of consumption. I do think that social analysts, economists, and sometimes we historians as well kind of underestimate the role of consumption and the importance of consumption to understand, social change. I mean, I do think that instead of seeing consumption as a tool for integration or domination or whatever you want to call it, or alienation, if you come from a more Marxist tradition, I would say that also consumption, when you live in a capitalist society mediated by the marketplace, is the way that you interact with your own standard of living, and that you interact with or is the way in which class struggle can be expressed. I mean, sometimes we think about what happened in the 40s and in the 50s in some Latin American countries when people began to have, like certain electronic appliances or an automobile or different durable consumer goods. And we tend to think about those processes in terms of integration or domination or alienation. And I do think that we are missing the point there. And I do think we need to understand the importance and the relevance that having a car, for instance, has to someone coming from a working class family, or a middle class family. So in that sense, I would say that consumption is crucial in terms of understanding what I was saying before about the perception of inequalities and the expectations about inequalities. So yeah, I mean, consumption is relevant because it's the way we kind of experience practically our standard of living. I mean, it's not just going back home and just have like certain commodities or certain goods there, but it's also the fact of being able to afford them and to have access to them. So when those perceptions about inequality begin to be a problem, then yeah, I mean, I would say that the sparkle that can set up the fire will probably has to do with some sort of basic need that is not fulfilled, in this case, transportation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right. And also, the spark here, is things which are quite basic, which it's not that people are rioting over the desire to have the new iPhone, for example.
Yeah.
So I think, and you're absolutely right to highlight that certain of the kind of academic treatments of consumption tend to be a bit snooty or snobbish, I guess, in looking at popular desires and aspirations for a higher standard of living as somehow bought off by consumerism or alienated or whatever. So I think that is worth highlighting. I think it would be nice to finish off on something a little bit thematic and looking at kind of how consumerism intersects with certain models of development in Latin America. But before that, it might be worth dedicating just a couple of minutes to Ecuador, because Ecuador similarly seems to be sparked off by protests around the increased cost of goods. So in this case was the ending of fuel subsidies. But it's rather different from Chile, both in the sense that Ecuador is a very different society to Chile. Chile is wealthier, has a larger middle class, and so on. But it was also that I think the level of social organization leading these protests was much greater than what is happening in Chile right now, right? I mean, this was indigenous groups and trade unions who led this in a way that I think the the Chilean eruption is a lot more spontaneous. So, I mean, what is your view on what's actually happened in Ecuador over the past month?
No, yeah, I mean, although Chile does have this kind of leftist tradition that is alive and a strong socialist and communist parties. But besides that, yeah, it's definitely true that the Ecuador society is completely different. Ecuadorian society is completely different, and there is this kind of political or social organization related to the indigenous movement called CONAIE, who historically, during the 80s especially, had a lot of power, and still it's quite a significant political actor in Ecuador, and they were partially involved with this protests. It's true that under Correa government, they were kind of against him, and in a way he was the only one who could actually rule the country, having them on the opposition. But right now it seems that there is like I would say there is like a stronger social or political organization behind the protests in Ecuador, which actually, I mean, the consequences of the protest was that this cut on the subsidy was disregarded, and it's not going to happen finally. So we have to see what happens. I do think that and this is a difference compared to the Bolivian case, where the indigenous organizations finally found a way to express themselves in the electoral arena. In Ecuador, that didn't happen in the last years, and the way the CONAIE solved this before was choosing Gutierrez as a candidate, and who was a military, and that didn't end that well. So before Correa, so right now, it's hard to tell what's going to happen. I mean, CONAIE has a really strong grassroots political organization, but so far we haven't seen them translating that into a more like an electoral alternative, let's say.
Right. No, that's interesting. I think it's something to keep an eye on, but because I think at least the initial wave of protests there in Ecuador has abated, because the fuel subsidy has been reinstated in a different form by Lenín Moreno. So that's something to watch out for, I think, as we go forward. Maybe as a way of wrapping up, we can talk a little bit about kind of return to the themes that we were talking about in terms of consumerism and development, because I think a lot of the discussion on the left, especially in Latin America, in terms of models of development, circulates around the question of what kind of consumerism should one hope for? What, should it just be the basics, and should we, forget about having the kind of consumer goods that are available in Europe and North America, because that's just not feasible? Or, should there be a return to, import substitution, industrialization, if that's possible at all? So, I mean, because I think this is some of your academic work, how do you see this playing out?
Well, it's an interesting point. Not because I care about, because I think it's important. I mean, I do think that during the 60s and the 70s there was really interesting debates in Latin America about what kind of development should we follow, and this was a rejection or a reaction against, if you want, the most mainstream theories coming from the modernization theory and the Rostownian versions of development. So in that sense, Latin America developed thanks partially to the dependence school and to Latin American structuralism. Latin America developed new theories about development that were super related to the kind of consumption and consumerism that was being shaped at the time. Briefly, I would say that the kind of consumption that you have will, in a way, shape the kind of development strategies you can have. So in the 70s, especially in the early 70s, there was this idea that Latin America it wasn't just consumption, but it was the lifestyle that Latin American countries were importing from, especially from the States, and how those lifestyles didn't have anything to do with what you could call a national or Latin American tradition. So in that sense, even in countries like Argentina, those discourses were kind of shaping the kind of development that these economists and sociologists were aiming for their countries. What is interesting is that after the 2000s, many countries, or some countries, especially Bolivia, but also in some senses Ecuador under Rafael Correa, began to talk again about these developmental debates and began to talk again about consumerism and the need to think about what kind of goods are we or do we think that are part of a reasonable standard of living for our population. And I do think that if you actually give that debate and you actually want to go through that debate, it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of a democratic society. I mean, we need to decide as much as we can all together what are we able to produce and what are we able to consume. And we cannot assume that this kind of promise of consumerism or this idealized neoliberalism, if you want, is that you can have whatever you want if you just effort yourself. I mean, and that's sustainable. I guess that with climate change and what we are seeing right now in terms of how are we destroying our only planet, I think that we need to begin to think about those patterns of consumptions and the kind of development that we want to pursue in the future.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, that's interesting. I think, the discussions around, what's called buen vivir or vivir bien in different countries, this alternative model of development you're discussing, on the one hand, seems sensible in terms of being appropriate to the stage of development. But at the same time, it seems to be a kind of post-materialist vision of one that accepts certain limits and closing off of possibilities of reaching a higher standard of living. On the other hand, the reality is that, it is a question, as you say, about how many social resources these countries should be developing towards importing, the most advanced consumer goods from elsewhere, and to what extent it should be producing them themselves or orienting consumption in other directions. And I think in especially highly unequal societies like you have in Latin America, a lot of the discourse, at least the mainstream discourse, is created by people who live in a completely different reality to the majority of the people. And therefore, having the access to certain consumer goods is a question which isn't even under consideration for a vast majority of people, for whom more basic necessities and the cost of utilities is a much more live issue than certain other kind of more advanced consumer goods, right?
No, yeah, that's definitely right, and I think right now, especially in Latin America, we need to think about the redistribution of income and to have people going out of poverty and extreme poverty, and that should be the main concern of any center left government right now in the region. Although I do think that there are certain, if you want, more ideological debates that need to be taken into account, especially by these new generations of activists who are being involved in politics. I do think that even if it's not the first issue we need to address right now, and right now we need to begin to close these income gaps, but also the gender gaps in Latin American societies. I do think that those are the crucial topics or items right now to be solved or to work with. But I do think that at the same time you do that, you need to have this more deep or long-term or cultural concerns about the future. So I do think that in politics you need to involve both levels. I mean, like the immediate needs, but also what kind of society are you looking forward to build? Because if you don't have the second one, then the first one is just, it could be, you could have like a progressive government and then a backlash, conservative backlash. But if you have clear objectives about what you want in the future, I guess that the way you go through more progressive measures in the immediate future will make more sense, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Those debates are important because protests and riots like you're having in Ecuador and Chile right now are just a way of yelling stop, but don't necessarily point to a specific way forward.
Yeah.
All right, Pablo, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. I think that was really insightful. We've covered a lot of ground, maybe in hopefully the requisite depth in each place. And if not, we'll have to call you back up again to get a little bit more.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. This was great. It was an amazing conversation.
Cheers, Pablo.
Cheers.
Thanks.
All right, that's it from Alpha Bunga Bunga this week. We are back next week with a patrons-only episode. That's at patreon.com/bungacast. If you aren't subscribed yet, we'd of course very much welcome and appreciate your support. We do slightly more intimate shows on there. And then we are back in 2 weeks' time, most likely with an episode on the current Kurdish situation. We'll be recording that in the coming days. Very excited to be doing that. If you like what we're doing and aren't in a position to subscribe, we would greatly appreciate you reviewing us on Facebook, on iTunes, wherever else you're able to leave us some gold stars. We're also available to follow on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter, always at BungaCast. That's it for now. Catch you later. Bye-bye.